Andrew Hartman is an associate professor of history at Illinois State University in Normal, where he teaches courses in intellectual, cultural, and political history. He grew up in Denver, got his BA in history from the University of New Mexico, and his PhD in history from George Washington University. His first book, Education and the Cold War, The Battle for the American School, was published in 2008. Later, he was the Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Studies at the University of Southern Denmark for the 2013-14 academic year. He's been published in a host of academic and popular venues, and he can now add us to his major achievements. So let's welcome Professor Andrew Hartman.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks, Alan, for the wonderful introduction and for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. I've been giving a lot of talks on this book for the past year. This is the first time the introduction included Woody Guthrie, and I'm quite happy about that, especially because I spent my Sunday mornings as a child in a very different setting, and Woody Guthrie was never part of the program. So I began researching this book in 2007, but really the book, or at least my curiosity about the culture wars, originated in at least two earlier moments in my life. The first was in 2001, when I lost my job as a high school history teacher in the Denver, Colorado area for essentially being too left-wing for the school administration. My lessons inspired students to organize against, for example, the pervasive military recruiters in the school. And I guess I'll add this for this audience. One of my students told his parents that he no longer believed in God due to my class, and they told the administrator. That was not my intention, but it happened. I learned firsthand that teaching history to children can be an intensely political act. That was something I knew in the abstract, of course, but needed to experience it myself to truly understand it. So this sparked my intellectual, my scholarly curiosity about conflicts over education and conflicts over history, and these are some of the conflicts that form the bedrock of my book. Another formative experience was George W. Bush's re-election in 2004. I opposed all that he stood for with every fiber of my being, so the fact that over 62 million of my fellow Americans voted for him gave me more motivation than ever to learn about this strange country that we call home, the United States of America. In this response to the 2004 election, I was not alone. The left-wing critic Thomas Frank from the Chicago area, his best-selling 2005 book, What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America, was his attempt to understand how the nation could re-elect Bush. Such a thing seemed so irrational to Frank, indeed, to many people. I read What's the Matter with Kansas within weeks of its publication, and at that time I remember nodding my head in agreement with his argument that the culture wars are superficial and help make our politics irrational. But the more I studied the history of the culture wars, the more I realized that Frank, at least in that specific argument, was wrong. So let me explain. Frank argues that religious conservatives often vote against their own economic interests due to their irrational obsession with the culture wars. In this line of thought, Republican politicians cynically lend rhetorical support to culture war issues as they focus on more important matters, such as rewriting the tax codes in favor of the rich. Frank relates the controversy, and this was a major controversy during the 1980s culture wars, the controversy over the artist Andres Serrano's blasphemous Piss Christ, a 1987 photo of a crucifix that was dunked or submerged in a jar of the artist's urine. He relates that controversy to his thesis that the culture wars get the goods. And here I'm quoting Frank in that book. Because some artist decides to shock the Hicks by dunking Jesus in urine, the entire planet must remake itself along the lines preferred by the Republican Party, USA. Now, Frank is a liberal who grew up in Kansas, in the heartland, and is disturbed by these developments in his home state. He's disturbed by these developments in the whole nation. Frank's fellow Kansans, his fellow Americans, defy his populist expectations that they direct their anger against the wealthy, at those responsible for making their economic lives so precarious. This might be compelling logic, but by this logic alone, the culture wars are mere sideshows, mere bread and circuses. So my argument is different. The history of the culture wars, or I would say the history of America, for better or worse, is largely a history of debates about the idea of America, about what it means to be an American. When the conservative politician and now television personality Patrick Buchanan declared a war for the soul of America during his rowdy speech during the 1992 Republican National Convention held in Houston that year, he offered one answer to this perennial question about American identity. He did so by restating a theme that had animated his underdog campaign against then-President George H.W. Bush in that year's primaries. This theme was the culture wars, a struggle, in Buchanan's words, as critical to the kind of nation we will one day be, as was the Cold War itself. With such urgent rhetoric, Buchanan wanted to raise the stakes of that year's election. More than a choice between Bush and the Democratic challenger Bill Clinton, and Hillary, it has to be said that Buchanan and conservatives always made clear that voting for Bill Clinton was also a vote for Hillary Clinton, his outspoken wife. More than that choice, Buchanan stated that the nation was confronted about a decision about who we are, about what we believe, and about whether the Judeo-Christian values and beliefs upon which this nation was built would survive. In other words, Buchanan knew what America was, and the Clintons were not it. Buchanan's speech punctuated a series of angry debates that dominated headlines during the 80s and 90s and that came to be called the culture wars. The list of divisive issues that were battles in the culture wars is long. Let me just say a few that I cover in my book: abortion, affirmative action, controversial art and censorship, evolution, family values, feminism, homosexuality, intelligence testing, multiculturalism, national history standards, pornography, school prayer, sex education. The list goes on and on. But no single one of these issues defines the culture wars. Rather, the culture wars have merely been ways to work out larger arguments about American identity and even, at times, about human nature. These types of arguments are always present in American political life. A nation that is founded on a capacious and contradictory ideal like liberty or the pursuit of happiness, such a nation is bound to have such debates. This is especially true during times of rapid change in the nation. Take, for instance, our most recent time of rapid change, the 1960s. The 60s gave birth to a new America, a nation more open to new peoples, new ideas, new norms, and new, if conflicting, articulations of America itself. This fact, more than anything else, helps explain why the nation grew more divided during and after the 60s than in any period in American history since the Civil War. And I always grant that the Civil War was a more divided America. So that is the crux of my book's larger argument. The 60s transformed American culture, and the culture wars, these debates that we've been having ever since then, are the legacy of those changes. That said, to say as much about the 1960s is not to say that these transformations emerged whole cloth during that decade. So let me give you a few examples. The 60s counterculture, this ethics of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and other things, grew out of earlier sensibilities of the Beats, those like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, pictured here, who brought bohemia to the masses with their unconventional writings. On the other side of the spectrum, those who supported the violent police crackdowns on protesters at the University of California, Berkeley during the 60s. Like, for example, Governor at the time, Ronald Reagan, called Berkeley a haven for sex deviants. These conservative attitudes emerged from earlier sensibilities, of those angered, for example, by Elvis Presley's pelvic gyrations on the Ed Sullivan Show. More crucially, the radical political mobilizations of the 60s, and by this I mean civil rights movement, Black and Chicano power, feminism, gay liberation, the anti-war movement, and the legal push for secularization, these movements destabilized the America that millions thought they knew. It was only after the 60s that many Americans, particularly conservatives, recognized the threat to their once great nation. It was after the 60s, so during the culture wars, whether one thought the nation was in moral decline was often directly related to whether one was liberal or conservative. The political scientist Joseph Epstein called the 60s something of a political Rorschach test. "Tell me what you think of the period," he wrote, "and I shall tell you what your politics are." Those who argued that the 60s had ushered in anarchy and that such confusion threatened the very fabric of the nation, they tended to be conservative. For instance, bringing back bad memories for anybody? The conservative judge Robert Bork, whose nomination to the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan was derailed in 1987 by liberals who were fearful of his views on abortion and civil rights. Bork wrote in a book that was published after his unsuccessful hearings, quote, so in other words, he was able to be more honest than he would have been had he been a Supreme Court justice. "The rough beast of decadence, a long time in gestation, having reached its maturity in the last 3 decades, now sends us slouching toward our new home, not Bethlehem, but Gomorrah." Bork's right-wing declension narrative advanced a theory of historical change that no matter how hyperbolic in tone, and it was hyperbolic, was more or less accurate. An older America had indeed been lost. This is where conservatives get the 60s right. This doesn't mean that we should agree with them, for example, that the 1950s were better, although I have some empathy with the fact that not everyone wanted such rapid changes to American society and that millions of Americans felt such changes as a profound sense of loss. But we do need to recognize that conservatives were right about things changing. In their eyes, things fell apart. In the post-war years, the nearly 2 decades between the end of World War II and the assassination of John F. Kennedy, a cluster of powerful conservative norms set the parameters of American culture. These cultural standards are best described by the phrase I use, and I call this Normative America. It's an analytical category I use to refer to a group of assumptions and aspirations shared by millions of Americans during the post-war years or during the 1950s. Normative Americans, and here it's represented here by a great Norman Rockwell painting. It should be noted that ironically, Rockwell, even though his paintings have, for me, come to symbolize this normative America of the post-war years, he was ironically a liberal Democrat who lived in some interestingly, non-normative ways. But normative Americans, as represented here, prized hard work, personal responsibility, individual merit, delayed gratification, social mobility, and other values that middle-class whites recognized as their own. 50s Americans lived according to strict sexual expectations. Sex, whether for procreation or recreation, was reserved for heterosexual marriage. Americans behaved in ways consistent with strict gender roles, or at least they aspired to. Within the confines of marriage, men worked outside the home, and women cared for children inside it. Television often conformed to these expectations, or even helped shape them, with shows such as Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. Pictured here, of course, is the iconic American family, the Cleavers. 50s Americans believed their nation was the best in human history. Those aspects of American history that shined an unfavorable light on their nation, such as slavery, were either ignored or explained away as aberrations. These normative Americans assumed that the nation's Christian heritage demonstrated its unique character. The United States of America really was a city on a hill. This American culture of the post-war years was more pervasive and perhaps more coercive than before or since. During the 1950s, an unprecedented number of Americans got in line or aspired to get in line, particularly white, heterosexual, Christian Americans. Even those Americans who were barred from this identity by virtue of their race, sexuality, or religion, or lack of religion, they often felt compelled to demonstrate some form of compliance. In part, such an extraordinary degree of conformity had to do with Cold War imperatives. A global struggle against an alien system required some form of cultural or ideological stability. But even more, the cohesiveness of this American culture, the seeming cohesiveness of it, was a byproduct of the internal threats to it. These threats were made manifest. They came to the surface during the 1960s. It was as if the dark clouds of dissent were visible on the not-too-distant horizon. It was as if Americans embraced cultural conformity in order to suspend their disbelief about what lurked behind such a facade. It was as if they knew that the 60s were coming. The new America given life by the 60s was a more pluralistic, a more secular, and a more feminist America. It was built on the ruins of this normative America. This basic historical fact explains the culture wars. It also explains the Jeremiads about a once great America that have flooded our political discourse ever since. Let's make America great again. Newt Gingrich, Republican Speaker of the House from 1994 until 1998, who of course became famous when he engineered a Republican House majority in 1994 by directly taking on the Clintons. Gingrich wrote an entire book appropriately titled To Renew America on the idea of post-60s decline. He wrote, quote, "From the arrival of English-speaking colonists in 1607 until 1965, from the Jamestown colony and the Pilgrims through de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, up to Norman Rockwell's paintings of the 1940s and 1950s, there was one continuous civilization built around commonly accepted legal and cultural principles." So America was the same from 1607 until 1965, and then everything went to crap. Simply put, for conservatives like Gingrich, the America they loved was in distress. Returning to the values that animated the nation in the 1950s, or perhaps the 17th century, was the only way to save it. This 1958 Rockwell painting is indicative. It's called The Runaway. As you can see, running away from home was not a dangerous or traumatic experience in this normative American imagination. It was a chance to bond with the local police officer over a root beer float. Contrast this with a more recent image from a 2009 photo gallery in the New York Times about teenage runaways. There was no safe return from the 60s. So the 60s divided us. Those on the left, in contrast with conservatives like Gingrich, tended to view American life through the eyes of the 60s, or rather, through the eyes of the women, racial minorities, gays and lesbians, secularists, and other Americans whose existence symbolized a challenge to this normative America. And I just throw the book cover up there because I think it's so visually nice. The University of Chicago Press did a nice job with that. It's kind of weird, but... So we can now better understand the major debates of the culture wars through this historical lens. The culture wars were battles over what constituted art and over whether the federal government should subsidize art that insulted the most cherished beliefs of millions of Americans. And this Piss Christ example is indicative. Serrano's photo became a lightning rod because, no matter his intentions, it indeed insulted people. And because the National Endowment for the Arts, which is funded, of course, by the taxpayers, it helped fund Serrano. And I should note that liberals at the time were willing to defend Piss Christ, but I think it's unlikely that they would have defended a Piss Muhammad. I think liberals, in terms of our attitude, of many people's attitudes towards free speech, have chosen, when having to choose between their liberalism and their multiculturalism, they often choose multiculturalism. The culture wars were also battles over transgressive films and television shows, and over whether insensitive cultural programming should be censored. This included Martin Scorsese's controversial film, The Last Temptation of Christ, about an all-too-human, sex-starved Jesus Christ, played by Willem Dafoe, pictured here. The Christian right worked very hard for years to stop the production of this movie, well before Scorsese even got his hands on the script, or began to produce the script. This was not the Jesus Christ of their imagination. The culture wars were also fights or brawls over the public schools, over whether American children should learn divisive subjects like evolutionary biology, which really continued a debate that went as far back as the 1920s with the infamous Scopes monkey trial. In the 1980s, several states, especially in the conservative South, like Tennessee and Alabama, they created laws that sought to require equal time for the teaching of creationism. But such laws were shot down by what had become a much more secular Supreme Court. The culture wars were also fights over how the nation's history was taught in schools and narrated in museums. Concerns about history, about the nation's history, climaxed during the national controversy surrounding the attempt by the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum to build an exhibit dedicated to the Enola Gay, the B-52 bomber used to drop an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The Enola Gay had never been put on display prior to this because of the ambivalence people felt about what it represented. Although for many Americans, perhaps a majority, it represented the victorious conclusion of what was called the Good War. For others, it stood for the onset of the nightmare-inducing nuclear age. But by the late 1980s, Smithsonian officials had concluded that it was time to display it. But given that Smithsonian curators were imbued with these 60s sensibilities, they had a more critical focus on the nation by this time, they thought that it should be presented in somber fashion, that it should not be celebrated. Thus, curators were tasked with creating an exhibit that was consistent with the Air and Space Director, the astrophysicist Martin Harwood's curatorial philosophy. Quote, "We can't afford to make war a heroic event where people could prove their manliness and then come home to woo the fair damsel." In July 1993, the Air and Space Museum released a planning document that outlined its objectives for this exhibit: to encourage visitors to undertake a thoughtful and balanced re-examination of the end of the Second World War and the onset of the Cold War, in light of the political and military factors leading to the decision to drop the bomb, but also to include the human suffering experienced by the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the long-term implications of the events of August 6th and 9th, 1945. In short, the exhibit took some of the questions that historians had been seeking to answer since the 1960s. Was the dropping of the atomic bombs necessary to end World War II? Many historians had made the revisionist argument that the atomic bombs were unnecessary to end the war. Truman, they contended, used them against Japan in part to better position the United States vis-a-vis its erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union. Another question, if the U.S. had to invade the Japanese mainland, the main island, in order to end the war, the rationale given by Truman at the time, and by supporters since, how many American casualties might we have expected? Which is another way of asking, how many American lives did the bomb save? Historians put their estimates around 30 to 50,000 American casualties. These are estimates consistent with predictions made by American intelligence in 1945. Truman put the figure much higher after the fact in his memoirs, which were published in 1955, and most Americans tended to follow suit after the fact in thinking that the bomb saved upwards of 1 million American lives. So this was bound to bring controversy. The curators also raised the moral specter. Was using a bomb of such horrific power immoral? The script thus included Admiral William Leahy's retrospective declaration that dropping the bomb adopted the ethical standards common to barbarians in the Dark Ages. In this vein, curators sought to include accounts by Japanese victims alongside artifacts and images of the blast zones. This was content that was intended to get visitors to the museum to think about the destructive force of nuclear weaponry and about the moral implications of using it. When the script was made public in early 1994, conservative veterans organizations, led by the enormously powerful American Legion, coordinated a highly effective campaign to block the exhibit. They called the script politically correct curating. They sent thousands of letters to members of Congress demanding that the exhibit be stopped. One form letter stated that it is an insult to every soldier, sailor, Marine, and airman who fought in the war against Japan or who were on their way to an invasion to defame this famous plane by using it as the centerpiece of a negative exhibit on strategic bombing. A letter signed by 24 members of Congress described the script as revisionist and offensive to many World War II veterans. The Senate resolved that the Smithsonian should avoid impugning the memory of those who gave their lives for freedom. Republican presidential candidate at the time, Rob Dole, warned of the threat posed by the arbitrators of political correctness and government and intellectual elites who seemed embarrassed by America. Texas Republican Sam Johnson, who sat on the Smithsonian Board of Regents and thus had some say here, proclaimed that the nation wanted the museum to reflect real America and not something that a historian dreamed up. Real America. Conservative pundits also chimed in. George Will charged that Smithsonian curators rather disliked this country. Rush Limbaugh labeled the Air and Space Museum interpretation blasphemous. So we're talking about the soul of America here. And he also got into a long discussion with his enormous radio audience about the premise of history. History, Limbaugh said, is what happened, no more, no less. This, of course, goes entirely against the grain of how academic historians think about history as not merely a body of known facts, but rather as a set of explanatory schemes or interpretations that are meant to be debated, challenged, even revised. But no matter that the curators wanted the exhibit to reflect these sort of best practices of historians, the Smithsonian caved to the political backlash. It was just too much for them to deal with. After several revised scripts failed to please veterans groups and other critics, the museum decided to display the Enola Gay alone and without context. In sum, those who saw it learned nothing and were not changed by seeing it, thus going against the stated mission of the Smithsonian to educate and enlighten the public. So liberals had a great deal of success during the culture wars, but in this case, not so much. It was one thing to have a more cosmopolitan view of Jesus, modern art, or even evolution. Liberals in many ways were successful in those areas of the culture wars. But it was another to question one of the nation's modern symbols, that of World War II. So nationalism really wins out here. Although in my book's conclusion, I argue that the culture wars are history and that the logic of the culture wars has largely been exhausted, this is an admittedly provocative conclusion that almost every reviewer of my book has disagreed with strongly, so we can discuss that in the Q&A if you'd like. I would say that the nation's history wars continue, especially in the schools and museums, probably always will. There's an ongoing controversy over revisions to the Advanced Placement U.S. History curriculum that serves as a case in point. AP U.S. History, as most of you no doubt are aware, is an exam that smart 16-year-olds all over the country take for college credit. It's created and administered by a private organization called the College Board, which also administers admissions exams like the SAT and the ACT. Conservatives charge that this new AP U.S. history framework de-emphasizes or even destroys the idea of American exceptionalism. And these critics have had some success since the College Board appeased them by scaling back some of its most important revisions. It's true that these original revisions were indeed meant to help fulfill the anthropologist Clifford Geertz's maxim that we see ourselves amongst others, which was definitely not consistent with American exceptionalism, but has been consistent with an approach to history that has long been normal in academic history. An end to these hostilities in the history wars is unlikely in the foreseeable future. So, we might chuckle and shake our heads in disbelief when current Republican presidential candidate, who briefly did very well in the polls, has since fallen off, not that he's been replaced by any more likable candidates. The brain surgeon, Dr. Ben Carson, he recently warned that the new AP U.S. history curriculum will convince young Americans to go sign up for ISIS. Yes, he actually did say that. Tongue half in jest, I don't know about that. So we should laugh, shake our heads, that's crazy talk, but we should not easily dismiss the conservative rationale undergirding such outlandish sentiments. This is because such sentiments are rooted in this half-century-long struggle which has pitted liberal, progressive, and secular Americans against their conservative, traditional, and religious counterparts. The culture wars have been the defining metaphor for the United States since the 60s. What my book has tried to do is make sense of the war. But a little bit later on in the Q&A, I would love to hear how you make sense about it all with your questions. Thank you very much.
So since you've been focusing on these culture wars for some time, I wonder if you could add any of your wisdom to the culture war that we're having over guns.
That's a good question. And it's a really tough one to answer because the issue of guns was not nearly as on the national. There were instances of gun reform and gun debates in the 80s and 90s, but it's become the central issue of our times now, right? Or one of the top 2 or 3 central issues of our time now. And has indeed taken on the rhetoric of the culture wars that were so prominent, especially in the 80s and 90s, in this very sort of all or nothing existential language. And what's interesting about this is that the National Rifle Association emerged much less, I mean, as a sort of tightly knit but still configuration of gun clubs around the country, and then became much more by the 80s and 90s a lobbyist for the manufacturing of weapons industry, but also under the leadership of Charlton Heston became much more of a culture wars organization and formed tight affiliates with conservative groups, religious groups, and Charlton Heston and the NRA took on stances and positions that you would think would be outside the purview of the National Rifle Association. And so the way in which the rhetoric gets played out in the gun debate now has a lot to do with the culture wars in terms of the all or nothing rhetoric of liberty versus and Americanism. So it seems very similar, and it didn't used to be that way, the debate over guns. But it's also, in terms of when you talk about if indeed liberals have won many of these culture wars, that's obviously one that liberals have not won anywhere near.
Okay. How do you differentiate the culture wars from the cultural changes that occurred during the movements for the women's right to vote, the temperance unit, or labor's collective bargaining? What differentiates the culture wars that you established after the 50s?
Another great question. So there's always been conflict in American society over cultural change and over an American identity, and this was extremely pronounced in other time periods, especially the 1920s. A lot of the changes that we see take place in the 1960s were beginning to take place in the 1920s, including an earlier form of the feminist movement that helped give women the right to vote. But I think that the events of the mid-century, the Great Depression, and then the World War, and then the Cold War, the early Cold War was very much a sort of continuation of World War II in terms of the way the nation thought and acted in many ways. Those events sort of created a climate that made cultural conformity and stability much more likely because the nation was projecting outward and there were other concerns. And so I think it's part of this continuous struggle for freedom that goes back to the Declaration of Independence. I mean, if you're going to propose a nation based upon such things as the pursuit of happiness for everybody, this sort of individual rights, Declaration of Individual Rights, then yes, even if at the time it only included white propertied men, eventually it would come to include, hopefully, the goal was always of the movements, everybody, and there would be major struggles over these. But it's really not until the 1960s, because of this previous sort of 30-year period of conformity, that a lot of these movements have a sort of breakthrough successes, and that really sort of pierces through and changes American culture much more dramatically than anything before. At least that's my argument. Many historians disagree with me, so.
Thank you. This morning I was watching news, and one of the pundits, Robert Gates, said that America was never more divided since Civil War as it is today. And I was just wondering if your thoughts about is it good, your value judgment, or what do you think about this division and where it's going to take us?
Is that statement good, or is it good that we're divided? Yeah. Well, I'm not certain. So in the 1950s, the U.S. was not divided, but that also meant that there was Jim Crow in the South. That also meant that there was a consensus about U.S. foreign policy that was increasingly aggressive around the world. So the fact that we're divided over some of these fundamental issues now, to me, is a mark of progress. Now, many people don't agree with me because they want to see Congress doing something. But at many points in our history, when Congress did something, from my vantage point, it was doing things that weren't good, especially during the 1950s. And so, yeah, I agree we're divided. We continue to be divided, and this division has only grown since the 1960s. And I think it's particularly acute right now because of economic inequality and the ways in which people have understood that, and which is why I argue that the culture wars issues of the 80s and 90s seem less paramount than other issues now. But I think I agree that we're very divided and that it's not a bad thing. If everyone would just join my side, that'd be better. But
so as a person who has lived through the generations that you have covered, I think there's something kind of that was missing and that I'd like to know about. And that was the McCarthy hearings. Mm-hmm. And now we have Bernie Sanders openly coming out as a socialist and being supported apparently by a large number of people who would have lost their jobs and so forth. So in that war, how do you explain what's happening?
Mm-hmm. Really interesting question. So, yeah, Bernie Sanders calling himself a socialist, and that only increases his likability amongst many people, especially young Americans. There's a number of factors here, I think, at work. Most importantly, you know, he's polling really high among young people. My students love him. They were born after the Cold War. This, like, terms, socialism is not a scare term for them. And in fact, insofar as their lives are defined by economic precarity, insecurity, there's no prospect for most of them that they're going to get jobs after they graduate from college. Maybe socialism isn't such a bad word precisely because what they hear from Bernie Sanders sounds like the solutions to the problems. I don't really even think Bernie Sanders is a socialist. He's a liberal Democrat of the sort of FDR generation. But because liberalism, especially through the lens of the Cold War, culture wars, has taken on such a different meaning. And it's much, his form of liberalism can now be called socialism. So I think, you know, the fact that we're now 25 years after the Cold War has a lot to do with it. My generation, yeah, I grew up in the 80s and the Cold War was there, but it was not something that felt like an existential threat or something that I think as a child I ever took seriously. There were a couple of interesting movies that came out of it. Rocky IV? And, you know, it didn't mean the thing that it meant to people of an earlier generation. And so the term socialism has lost its scare tactic ability.
So about identity, looks like identity came to the fore lately in regards to race. Black Lives Matters. We have polarized, society is polarized. So my question to you is about your opinion. Do you think that identity politics are, that cohesiveness and strengthening identity is constructive in the long run for humanism? Mm-hmm. Or is it a destructive force that brought American exceptionalism, racism, genderism, and the rest? Well, you can tell what's my opinion.
Yeah, and that actually is one of the questions that informs my book. I was writing the last few chapters and the conclusion while I was living in Denmark, teaching in Denmark. and really thinking, it profoundly shaped the way I thought about American history and the topic of the culture wars, because that nation, this is the nation that Bernie Sanders has been touting as the model, has a working social democracy. And so I was constantly sort of thinking about what makes it tick and how is it different, how is Danish society and culture different from American society and culture that allows for such a politics. And partly, it's because, just partly, it's a much more homogenous society. And the things that have divided us, race and identity politics perhaps, make such a politics of cohesiveness, a cultural cohesiveness that is necessary for social democracy, less possible. That said, when you look at the movements of the 1960s, which in many ways were based on identity politics, I don't know what option they had, because 50s culture was very cohesive, and that's what allowed, to some degree, for our own modest form of social democracy, the New Deal. During the New Deal years between the 30s and the 1960s, immigration from strange foreign lands was very limited, and such things, in fact, made social democracy more possible because people felt that high taxes were going towards their fellow Americans. And I think it's not a coincidence that after the civil rights movement and after the changing of immigration laws, that more and more, especially white Americans, don't want to pay high taxes. It's not just that they are personally affronted, like an infringement upon their liberty, but they don't think their taxes are going to pay for their fellow Americans. And so it's a tough situation, because identity politics, I think identity politics can and do divide us, but the alternative, I don't know what the alternative is either.
Could you just briefly touch on one of the figures I think is important in the culture wars, and actually he almost had like a deathbed apology for his role in it, that being Lee Atwater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. He was one of the architects of the continuation of the Republican Party sort of Southern strategy of using race-coded language by any means necessary in order to get white voters to the polls for Republicans. And yeah, interesting that he apologizes for it at his deathbed. But we're definitely, what has helped Republicans in the past no longer helps them, at least in national elections along those lines, because the nation has become so much more diverse, and minority voters matter so much more, at least in national elections, that strategy in the long run is not, I think, not going to bear as much fruit. But they'll ride that strategy out for a while.
Can you go back to Europe? I think you're a little too fast to say it's just homogeneity, because a lot of the cultural stuff that is taboo here is not even debated at all in Europe. All the gender stuff, the homophobia, there's a whole range of stuff where Europe, it's a settled matter and there's not a debate. I think the only thing that's debated in Europe is immigration. And so I take the point about nationalism and immigration, but why did they get there? And why hasn't there, despite the fragmentation in Europe, there's no pushback on these margins? So how do you explain that?
No, that's a good question. And I don't want to sort of elide a really important history that created social democracy in Scandinavian countries, and that's the labor movement. They had extremely powerful, cohesive labor movements in the early 20th century that made anything less impossible for politicians of any political party in, for example, the Danish parliament. But also, one of the main differences has to do with religion. The United States is an extremely religious country, and we have a lot of, right now, 25% of the population is white evangelical, and that is an important sort of block of voters that make these sort of issues that are settled in Europe unsettled here. In Denmark, everyone that I met was an atheist. even though there's a national church. And so there's just, it's, you know, that religion really matters in the United States.
Okay. I have a question. Do you feel that we have hit what's called, or what could be called, peak information? In other words, there's now diminishing returns on the quality of information that we get because there's just so many sources of it, given the technology that we live in? And how does that, you know, if you do feel that's something that does exist, how does that benefit one group or another that's currently at war for the soul of America?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we don't have enough good investigative journalism. In fact, we have less of it now because there's not actually sort of resources for investigative journalism the way there used to be. But there's certainly a lot of information and a lot of analysis all over the place. But I think, you know, if you go back to the progressive era, intellectuals, even, you know, some of my favorites, W.E.B. Du Bois, they had a lot of faith in social science. If they could disprove scientifically this, like, notions of eugenics or scientific racism, they could convince most people that it's untrue. And I think that is, even though I love Du Bois, and I hate to say this, but that's a little naive. But it was true of many progressives in that era. I think that we have these sort of core, sort of positional, ideological views right now, and we gravitate towards information that supports those views. And so it's really hard to break through that. It doesn't mean it's not worth trying. I mean, I'm a teacher. I get out of bed every day because I think it's worth it, worthwhile and possible, but it's very unlikely.
You talked about the cohesiveness of the 50s, but aren't you really talking about a fairly small group of the population, white, nuclear families, certain income level, et cetera? I can understand that that's sort of the hegemonic culture, but what about everybody else?
Yeah, and I don't argue that there didn't exist everybody else. And so this is actually one of the arguments in the book, that the sense of conservatives, white religious Americans especially, felt everything after the 60s is sort of fractured. And I would argue that many Americans felt American culture had always been fractured and only actually felt a little more whole after the 60s. So I agree with you. But hegemonic is really key here, and it was a very pervasive hegemony, since we're using that academic term, which makes sense to me.
You talk about this war for the soul of America. How would you compare this war that was in the late 20th century with the one in the 19th century, which was over this terrible issue of slavery? It really divided the country and tore us apart. Do you see similarities, or is it just that we're more worried about what's happening now and not so much about 200 years ago?
Yeah, we were much more, the U.S. was much more divided leading up to the 1860s. The culture, the militarization of our language is sort of pervasive now, and so culture wars as a metaphor is overstated. It's not an actual war, except for a few instances usually associated with the issue of abortion. Not people aren't getting murdered over these culture wars, whereas in the Civil War, 600,000 Americans lost their lives. The language is oftentimes as sort of existential, and I think some Americans, a small minority, would be willing to perhaps ratchet it up to extend that to an actual war. But I think this is, American political rhetoric is overheated. We're not Canada. We speak really loud and angry, and we sometimes have very hyperbolic, militarized language, and I think that's true in these culture wars. So I don't think it's an actual war like the Civil War was. That was considered much more existential, and thus people were willing to die for it.
Flex,
Thank
you're
you.
on.
Thank you all.